A former Home Secretary said intelligence and security services could be reluctant to work with her. Lord Blunkett is one of many to criticise Rishi Sunak's decision to reappoint Ms Braverman after she was investigated over the leaking of a story involving MI5. LBC's political correspondent Ollie Barrett has been following today's developments.
The spokesperson for Rishi Sunak said today that yes, the Home Secretary does have strong relationships with all of the operational bodies that report into the Home Office. Rishi Sunak's spokesperson was further asked whether there might be a concern that some security officials might be reluctant to share information with Suella Braverman, given some of the recent revelations. And Rishi Sunak's spokesperson said no, any suggestion of that would be entirely false.
The deadline is drawing nearer for fresh Assembly elections to be called in Northern Ireland after politicians failed to reform a power-sharing deal in the region. Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris has warned he'll have to call another vote if the deal isn't made before midnight. Vladimir Putin says Liz Truss was crazy to raise concerns about nuclear weapons while serving as Foreign Secretary. Speaking through a translator during an event in Moscow, the Russian president says she must have been a bit out of it.
We've never said anything proactively about possible use of nuclear weapons by Russia. We have only hinted in response to those statements that the Western leaders have made.
Mr. Putin also accused the West of fueling the war in Ukraine and destabilising the world food and energy markets. Officers who've just joined the Metropolitan Police are being told to confront and challenge racist and misogynistic behaviour among colleagues. The new head of the force, Sir Mark Rowley's been speaking during a graduation ceremony in Hendon. Victim support groups say women deserve better after a sharp rise in violent and sexual offences led to a record high for police-recorded crime. In England and Wales, 6.5 million reports were recorded in the 12 months up to June. And flu levels are rising in England, with rates highest among children. The UK Health Security Agency says there's also been a drop in the number of 2- and 3-year-olds getting a free nasal vaccine from their GP. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 18 points at 70.74. The pound buys $1.16 and €1.16. LBC weather: rain moving north overnight, dry for northern Scotland and eastern England, and lows of 11 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Tim Daly.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8 on LBC. I'm Iain Dale, here with you until 10. Now, we're streaming this next hour on Global Player, if you'd like to watch us as well as listen to us. And we are in the company of Roger Mosey. He's currently Master of Selwyn College, Cambridge. Sounds a very, very grand title. And Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. But from our point of view, and this is the most important bit, he's former Editorial Director of the BBC and former Director of TV News, held all sorts of positions in BBC Radio, including editing the Today programme and controller of 5 Live. And he's written a book called 20 Things That Would Make the News Better. If you're watching, here it is. And I think it's a fantastic subject for a book, and in a way I'm really jealous because I wish I'd thought of it myself, because I think we've all got ideas about how we think the news should be, how it could be better, how things could be changed to make it more relevant to our lives. Because this whole idea of objectivity, of impartiality, I think maybe we'll develop that a bit over the course of the hour. But of course, it's actually impossible to be totally objective, because the very decision that an editor makes on what to include in a programme is a subjective decision. If you're planning an hour-long news programme and you have, 8 or 10 slots to fill, you're making a subjective decision by choosing to include one news story over and above another, which other people might think was more important. So it's a hugely complicated area. And of course, we're now in the era of fake news. And I think that's added a lot to it. We're in the era of 24-hour news channels, but I wonder whether they're about to be slightly made redundant. I wonder how many people now watch 24-hour news for more than a few minutes at a time just to get the headlines, because we live in a society where we're told that we have the attention span of a flea. So all these viral videos from this hour, there may well be a video that is put out that's 90 seconds long. Does it have the context of the rest of the discussion? Possibly not. So everything is changing in how news is covered. And Roger is looking at how we can make the news better. So we'd love to get your input into this. Maybe you have some ideas. Maybe you have some criticism of the way different broadcasters, not just the BBC, but maybe ourselves as well, how we cover the news. We have as you know, a rolling news channel now, LBC News, which has proved to be incredibly popular. I mean, it's getting between 500,000 and 1 million people listening every week, which I'm not sure when it was set up whether people thought it would be that popular, but it's the news every 20 minutes, and so you can keep up to date in a very accessible way. Roger, welcome.
Well, it's lovely to be here, Ian.
Well, it's great to have you here because you have so much experience to bring to this subject. Now, what made you want to write this book in the first place?
It's what you just said, really, which is there's a huge amount of stuff around, and social media and bad actors like the Russian government and the Chinese government. And therefore, I think it's really important that public service broadcasting and impartial news are preserved. But what you're seeing is trust is being eroded in them. So if you look at the figures, people don't trust them as much as they used to do. So I was trying to answer the question, why is that? And you're right that you can't be absolutely impartial about everything, but some people are now using the phrase not being biased, and I think that's quite helpful, that as you hear lots of things around the world which are opinionated or biased or untrue, you do need somewhere you can go to try and get the best shot at what really is happening.
We've got all sorts of different news providers now. It used to be, well, initially just the BBC in terms of broadcast. Then ITV came along, then Channel 4, Channel 5. On the radio, also 1973, LBC started. 49 years ago, we celebrate our 50th anniversary this time next year. And now you've got all sorts of other speech radio stations as well. So there's a multitude of places for people to go. Do you worry that we are entering the same kind of news environment that America has experienced maybe for several years, where people prefer to access their news through the prism of their own political leanings? So if you are on the right, you are going to go to a certain news channel. If you're on the left, you're going to go to another.
There is that risk, and you see it in America, to name the names, Fox News and MSNBC. And I sat one night in Los Angeles and watched the two alternately. And they've got different stories, different facts, different guests. The whole things are poles apart. Now, being here on LBC has got a very interesting model, which was pioneering, where you have something that the broadcasting regulators call due impartiality. So you achieve impartiality over a period. But Nick at breakfast and James O'Brien in mid-morning have a very different take on the world. But by having opinionated views through the day, you still achieve some sort of balance across the whole of the schedule. I think that's very clever and innovative. And I know some people in the BBC are actually rather jealous of the fact that LBC can, if you like, have its cake and eat it. What I wouldn't like, though, is you wouldn't want LBC to be only left-wingers or only right-wingers, because I think if you did that, you'd lose.
According to social media, we are. We're the Labour Broadcasting Corporation, or we are sort of fascist broadcasting corporation, and there doesn't seem to be anything in the middle. And this is where the whole arguments on social media just descend into farce.
That's right. And social media, I mean, I use social media and I enjoy social media, but there's no doubt it is a bad effect on conventional journalism, partly because there are people yammering away and attacking you and destroying the foundations of what you do if you're not careful, and also because people will use very extreme language. And I find it interesting talking to the students at Selwyn that most of them now are not on Twitter, and they see Twitter as being people of my age and your age shouting at each other, and they're not altogether wrong about that. And I think Twitter in particular is a really bad influence on broadcast news, and it'd be better for a lot of people in broadcast news just to shut it down and not use it.
So they don't use Facebook either, do they? Because that's apparently an old
Facebook is now for
thing.
grandparents,
So they don't use Facebook or Twitter, so what do they use?
Instagram is probably the one they use a fair bit. They watch TikTok, they use YouTube. But I would say the people coming in the last year or two have been using less social media. And I really applaud that, and I wish really I could give up social media. We all think we would quite like to, and then we keep being tempted back. But if this generation can break free of social media, it would be for the good of everybody, really.
What do you say in the book about impartiality and objectivity? Because, of course, the BBC has a remit to be completely impartial and gets into trouble from time to time when we can all think of examples where it's got into trouble. Is it actually possible in today's news environment to be impartial?
It is, and the most fascinating thing in the BBC in the last couple of years has been the Director General saying that impartiality is top of his list. And if you listen to Tim Davie carefully, he says the BBC has been a bit too metropolitan. He has edged towards saying the BBC's been a bit too liberal, and it's really important to bring the BBC back to traditional values. And I think if you just take the metropolitan bit of it, the BBC is now concentrated in one very powerful building in New Broadcasting House, where everybody who makes decisions is taking those decisions. And they can't really know what's happening if you're a nationalist in Dunfermline, or a UKIP voter in Bridlington, or a hill farmer in Brecon. How do they really know what those people think? And of course, the difference between LBC and the BBC is that you are forced to pay for the BBC. It's a compulsory tax. And part of the disaffection has been people thinking, well, they don't know what I'm thinking and they don't know what my views are. And notably, of course, not really seeing the Brexit tide coming was a major editorial miss.
David Dimbleby was sitting in that very seat 2 weeks ago, and I asked him about the licence fee, and he rather surprised me by saying that he thought that he agreed with the principle of it, but he thought it needed reforming in the next 10 years and was quite trenchant on that. Given that it's been in existence ever since, when did it start?
The BBC started
decades
I think
ago.
they may have mentioned it started 100 years ago.
Given that we live in an era where people are used to paying subscriptions for what they view now, rather than just a licence fee, do you think that the licence fee will still exist in 10 years' time in its current form?
It may not do, and the argument has always been it's the least worst way of funding the BBC. For me, the big problem is it's not progressive. So everybody in this cost of living crisis has to pay the same amount of money. So there's an argument that says, why not fund it from general taxation? And at least that would be the rich paying more. The problem people then say is, well, the government would interfere. Well, the government does interfere quite a bit already, so I'm not sure that would be necessarily worse. Or the other possibility, you can't do subscription on mainstream radio or on Freeview, but you could do subscription on the iPlayer. So you could have most of the iPlayer available free to people for the licence fee or a smaller licence fee, and then charge a premium subscription service for box sets or the whole of the prom season. So that is possible, and I would be surprised if the BBC hasn't looked at that.
It seems to me over the past 15 years, and I don't want to get necessarily hooked up on the BBC because there's so much more to covering news than just the BBC, but it is our national broadcaster. And over the past 10, 15 years, news and current affairs have had their budgets slashed and had to basically sack a lot of people, not just sort of front of camera, sort of on mic people, but producers, support staff. And I'm thinking, well, if the BBC isn't going to cover politics, foreign news in the way that it did, what is it for? And I was reminded of this on Monday or Tuesday. Newsnight have got a new thing called Newsnight Global, and they did a whole programme from Taiwan, and it was the most magnificent piece of broadcasting I've seen in a long, long time. And I'm thinking, this is what we should be having more of. And obviously it's expensive to broadcast something from Taiwan, but it was just a great piece of, I felt educated. I felt I learned something about the world from it. And I see this all the time on Al Jazeera. In Al Jazeera English, they do fantastic world news coverage, which I think we're not getting from the BBC at the moment. So that's one thing. If I was writing your book, that would have been front and centre.
I watched that programme too, and it was fantastic. If you look now at some of the things playing on BBC One in prime time, and I'm a journalist, so I'm biased, and I think news is important, but that programme Unbreakable with the bloke who's in everything is both terrible, it got 1-star reviews, and is also getting 800,000 viewers in peak time. So I think you could put higher quality news content into parts of the BBC One and Two schedule. I mean, the problem with that Taiwan programme is it was on at 11:15 at night. And if you look at some of the ratings of things earlier, the BBC could show its ambition and its global reach by putting more of that into the peak schedule. And of course, as a journalist, I would make smaller cuts to news and bigger cuts to all the antiques, quiz, cookery programmes, which you can find on any other channel. So there isn't a market argument now for the BBC making as many daytime type programmes as it does.
Well, we're going to move on to talk about some of your 20 ways to make the news better in just a moment. That is nearly the title of Roger's book. It's actually called 20 Things That Would Make the News Better by Roger Mosey. He's going to be taking your calls after past as well. So if we can line them up, please, on 0345 6060973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 8:15.
This is LBC.
COVID-19.
On LBC.
19 minutes past 8 on LBC. Talking of podcasts, there's a new edition of the For the Many podcast with me and Jackie Smith about to hit your phones, so you'll be able to download it at some point during the course of the evening. Roger Mosey is with us, Master of Selwyn College, Cambridge, former TV and radio executive with the BBC. We're going to come to your calls, text, tweets at about past, maybe a little bit before. But before that, I want to look at one or two of the subject areas in Roger's book. It's called 20 Things That Would Make the News Better. And it's divided into, surprisingly, 20 chapters. Now, one of them, chapter 15, is called Invest in Interviewing. And this is an obsession of mine because I think that the general public have been let down for far too long by the way that interviews are conducted on news programmes. Do you agree?
I do agree. And I think there are two things going on. One is that there's a bit of a kind of boy racer catch 'em out attitude on the part of interviewers. So actually the kind of interviews that you've done and other people do, which are longer and may seem in one respect a bit gentler, can be a lot more revealing. Famously your Theresa May interview about which way she'd have voted in a Brexit referendum. And then the second part is politicians, it's become industrialised. They go on a circuit and they do 23 interviews in a day and they say the same thing in every one. And they lose that ability to be spontaneous or think an interesting thought. Also going on, of course, is that, and I'm very careful not to believe that everything was perfect 30, 40 years ago, but there used to be big set-piece interviews in prime time on television. So Mrs. Thatcher would be interviewed by David Dimbleby in the peak BBC One schedule. ITV would have Weekend World with Brian Walden, long interviews. And, of course, Boris Johnson have evaded pretty much all scrutiny and famously didn't do the Andrew Neil interviews in the 2019 general election. And I think there's a real loss for democracy that you don't have that kind of accountability. And what now people say is, well, we all knew that Boris was like he was. Well, if you were watching TV, you didn't really, because you didn't really have that in-depth scrutiny of his policies. And ditto Liz Truss. I mean, can you remember an hour-long interview with Liz Truss anywhere? I mean, you might not have wanted one, but it would have been revealing.
I don't think you would remember it if it had happened.
But maybe if it had happened, then you wouldn't have had the prime ministership that you had. So I think there's an accountability. And for people interested in politics, seeing a politician being interviewed at length, probingly but fairly, is a right thing to do.
And I think that's right, particularly with cabinet ministers who are not always household names. OK, that you'd like to think the Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary would be. But often you can learn so much about people in these interviews because after 5 minutes, they've run out of sound bites. And so you have and I like to think that interviews in part should be conversations. And if you have a conversation with somebody, you probably learn something interesting about them if you allow them to speak rather than trying to interrupt every few seconds.
Yeah, and what you've also got is a Westminster game of gotcha and a Westminster obsession with process. So I don't think most people in the country care about who's up or who's down. What they care about is there a good education system? Is there a good healthcare system? And one of the things I say in the book is that think about the amount of time during the pandemic we spent thinking, should Gavin Williamson be sacked or not as Education Secretary? And how much time we should have spent debating, is it safe to reopen schools? And the damage now done to a generation of children because we didn't have that debate properly contrasts with Westminster political correspondents doing the, is Gavin going to go or not, and how much is the algorithm his fault, which I don't think really plays that much in Southport.
Another chapter, Cover What Matters. Now, you'd like to think that any news channel worth its salt would be covering what matters, but who decides what matters?
Well, if you have strong editors, they will sometimes take a chance on, Taiwan that you mentioned is a very good example. That could be the next global flashpoint. And there was at times in the BBC something called the significance test. Is it significant and should we cover it? And I don't think that means at all that you can't also do some showbiz stories or sports stories or other things. But you want to make sure that you've covered the big things that are going to change people's world.
But the problem is, if you are doing television rather than radio, if you haven't got the pictures, what are you going to do? It's like the Iran protests, which I think haven't been covered well on UK media more generally. We've tried to do our bit. In fact, the next hour we're going to be covering those protests again. But if you haven't got the pictures and you can't verify the pictures, even if you have them, and you're the BBC, it's quite difficult to do much with that, isn't it?
It's true, and I wouldn't say this is entirely the BBC's fault, but if you are claiming you are the world's greatest news organisation, what track record did the BBC have of telling us about what was building up in Ukraine? Not this year, where it was all extremely good, the coverage was excellent this year, but the underplaying of defence correspondence, the lack of coverage of day-to-day what was going on in Russia and Putin. So all the clues were there with everything that happened in 2008 and 2014, but you need that sustained investment in foreign reporting. And some editors some days who are going to say what's happening with Putin is more important than this row in Westminster about who's on a select committee or not.
Do you also think that there's an imbalance in international coverage, not just on the BBC but elsewhere too, where we are obsessed with the United States of America? And I can remember when I first joined LBC, there was some minor plane crash in Florida. It was a light aircraft to kill 2 people. And that was considered a really big news story. I was thinking, what on earth is going on here? This wouldn't happen if it was in Bangladesh or something. And it's like we don't cover floods in Bangladesh, but if there's a flood in Nevada, well, actually it's unlikely in Nevada, isn't it? But in New Orleans, it's top of the news agenda. Doesn't that need to change?
Yeah, I should say that I was thoroughly imperfect in all sorts of ways as a journalist and as a manager. Well, one of the things I failed to do was stop the obsession with especially the American primary process, where every year people go to the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary. And of course, we now know the Iowa caucus doesn't matter and New Hampshire barely really has a direct effect. And where you're right, the serious issue is that sometimes a hurricane would go across the Caribbean and people would be dying and dead in Caribbean countries. Only when it hit Florida would we be going to the live reporters standing out in the wind looking, with the rain coming down on them. So that is quite a serious thing because people in this country have relatives and friends in the Caribbean as they do in Florida, and only having the pictures when they hit America is a pretty bad outcome, really.
Another chapter, Vanquish Vox Pops. Hallelujah. What... and this is in the cost of living crisis. This is quite a difficult one because I am fed up with so-called news programmes interviewing Mrs. Miggins from 32 Acacia Avenue, Doncaster, about how terrible her life is. Now, does that qualify as news?
It's also sometimes impossible really to get a proper reaction. I cite the way that reporters are sent out to say, what do you think of Keir Starmer's Labour conference speech? And the fact is that 99% of the country have not seen it live. And the thing that they do get influenced by is the way it's cut up and used in the bulletins where they're asking people how they're responding to it. So I think they're largely pointless. And of course, the other thing is that they are balanced. So I'm in favour of impartiality generally, but often with a Vox Pop, you'll get someone saying, I like Rishi Sunak, someone else saying, I don't like Rishi Sunak, and someone saying, I don't know yet. Yeah. And how much does that enlighten you? So I would rather have news about what's happening.
That's impartiality, isn't it? Because
which is why I wouldn't do them. But the point is that if you send someone to Wakefield, how often do you really feel that you know Wakefield better, as opposed to you've just got a few random voters saying things? And I do believe, the whole point about LBC and 5 Live, where I used to work, is they do have the voices of the British people in those programmes shaping the content. And I think that does genuinely work. It's in television where the random Vox Pop is infuriating and pointless.
Now, the chapter I most enjoyed was chapter 11, Stick with Presenters, which I think is a laudable aim.
I've got the book here, and I think I start that chapter by saying they're a funny lot, presenters.
Well, that's true.
And presenters, you can't do radio and TV without them, and they are wonderful.
You'd quite like to, wouldn't you?
Yeah, it does. It starts a funny lot.
It's like political agents. They regard candidates as a legal necessity, and that's about it.
Yeah, and there are some presenters where your heart is in your mouth thinking, what on earth are they going to say next? Other presenters where you can just leave it with them and they'll be better than you are at coming up with a great programme. And I cite examples where, if you're a BBC manager or an editor, you get people flattering you and saying how marvellous you are and how you've been an inspiration to their career. I had at least a couple of cases of that where, having then hired these people, I wasn't even invited to their leaving party when they went because I'd so fallen out of favour or fashion, or they no longer needed you. And look, presenters, I admire them because they're the people putting their face and their reputation on the line, and we just sit behind the scenes and press the buttons. But I don't dissent from the idea that they are a curious bunch of people sometimes.
Well, I would completely admit that. And I mean, it must be difficult as an executive, as an editor, dealing with the presenter egos, because there is no one that appears on the media that hasn't got an ego. I mean, let's be clear about that. And managing this team of giant egos who take exception when they think one of their colleagues is being treated more preferably than they are. I mean, that must be incredibly difficult.
I'm not going to name names here,
go on.
But I remember during the Iraq War, obviously a really serious major international event. But my personal memories of that are that we were trying to do a combined news and current affairs programme with a distinguished news presenter and a distinguished current affairs presenter, and both wanted to open the programme. So when they say now on BBC One over 2, they wanted to be there. So at 2 minutes to go, we were in a standoff and saying, well, I won't introduce it if he is on, and he won't do it if I, and doing that diplomatic UN type mediation between presenters is one of the things you're doing when you should be thinking about what is the editorial content of the programme. It happens quite a lot.
Now, we're going to go to your calls in a moment, 0345 6060973. But before we do that, you were running 5 Live when Miss Sheila Fogarty was on 5 Live. Any gossip you can share with us?
Well, I'll wait until the commercial break and then I'll take you through it.
Right, let's go to the news headlines at 8:30 with Tim Daly.
The Prime Minister has defended Suella Braverman after a former Home Secretary said intelligence and security services could be reluctant to work with her. Rishi Sunak is facing criticism before she was investigated over the leaking of a story involving MI5. Northern Ireland politicians have failed to elect a speaker to the Stormont Assembly, meaning a power-sharing executive can't be formed. Westminster is now likely to order another election, the second this year, unless a deal is done before midnight. And Italian media are reporting the former Manchester City footballer Pablo Mari has been stabbed in a shopping centre in Milan. It's understood the defender, who currently plays for Monza while on loan from Arsenal, is conscious in hospital and was one of 6 people injured during the attack. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 18 points at 70.74. The pound buys $1.16 and also €1.16. LBC weather: rain moving north overnight, dry for northern Scotland and eastern England, with lows of 11 degrees.
This is LBC.
Love
Britain's Conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:35. Roger Mosey is with us talking about his book 20 Things That Would Make the News Better. We're going to go to your calls, texts and tweets right now. Paul is in Brighton. Hello, Paul.
Right. Also, I'm not as eloquent or intellectual as you, but my point is...
I've never been called intellectual, Paul.
Well, you are compared to me. But anyway, my point is that I find the media very biased about Brexit and other items, but especially Brexit, because the media seems to have a big campaign at the moment. And this is, listening to the radio all day as I do, and different commentators all over the place. Like Emily Matus on the news agents today on her podcast had an issue about Brexit, and it summed up that when she gave all the reasons for Brexit, why people voted to leave, she didn't actually state the reason that people did vote to leave. And the reason is because the people at the bottom of the pile, unlike the media, who are somewhere nearer the top of the pile, haven't had a pay rise of 10, 15 years and seen all their jobs eroded by the importation of cheap foreign labour. And that is why, because they didn't feel the benefits of being European, that's why I didn't vote to be European, because I couldn't feel the benefits of it. Now, if you had a load of media-type people come across from the continent and take all your media jobs or apply for all your media jobs at half the rate and then not go take a pay rise, and you didn't have to take a pay rise for 10 years and your money's been slashed in half, how would you report Brexit then? How would you report staying in Europe? Because you wouldn't, as you had no benefit from it, you wouldn't want to stay in it, would you? Or you'd want to protest about it. The funny thing is, it's the one thing David Cameron got right. He went to Europe and said, look, unless you stop the freedom of movement, the people are going to vote to leave. And surprise, surprise, they did.
Well, it's interesting because Roger picked up on that earlier. Now, you say you're not eloquent, Paul. I think that's probably one of the most eloquent arguments I've heard put for that side of the debate. But he's got a good point there, hasn't he, Roger? In that you said earlier that the BBC didn't see Brexit coming, and that was part of the reason.
I think most of the media didn't see Brexit coming. And I agree with Paul. I think that people didn't see what was happening on the ground. And equally, I say in the book that if you talk to people who were working at the time at Radio Lincolnshire, and they had a large number of immigrants coming into Boston and other places in Lincolnshire, and the tide against the EU was phenomenally strong. And the people in Lincolnshire could hear it and see it and know about it, and yet it wasn't really listened to by the editors in London. And there's a quote in the book from Robert Peston, who is obviously brilliant, and Peston says he didn't know anybody in his circle of friends who was going to vote for Brexit. Now, if he'd lived in Wisbech or Boston or maybe Brighton, probably not Brighton, but you would have seen that tide coming and realised why people were voting against the EU. And I equally think there's now a really lazy cliche that if the TV companies and radio companies want to get Brexit voters, they go and find angry people in a chip shop in Bridlington. And of course, Sevenoaks voted 54% to leave, and lots of people in Waitrose in Sevenoaks were Leave voters. And somehow there's this stereotyping what a Leave voter was, which doesn't help the debate.
Well, the stereotyping of a Leave voter it was portrayed, I think, at the time in large parts of the media as some sort of thick, stupid racist. And I mean, there weren't 17 million thick, stupid racists voting for Brexit. And I don't think the media in general really has ever caught up with that.
No, and I think there's a system problem in that it goes back to this thing about everybody being in London, and what people don't understand sometimes is the towns of England. And in the towns of England, that's where pretty much every town in England voted to leave. Now, I do think I'm not. I've said in the book I was a Remain voter because I'm part of the Metropolitan Liberal chattering classes, but I think that the missing of the tide was a very, very big problem for all the broadcasters and all the media. I think it also meant they weren't credible when they were sometimes analysing Brexit.
And it was the same with Trump in America, wasn't it? That people didn't see him coming in the same way because they weren't out there in Pittsburgh. They were in New York and Los Angeles.
Yeah, and if you had a broadcasting system based in Missouri, you might have better got the fact that why people were voting for Trump. But it doesn't mean that you accept. You need to understand the whole country, but you can then also give some facts. So it is true that overwhelmingly most economists said in 2016 we would be some degree worse off by leaving the EU. But if you think that sovereignty is the most important thing, or stopping immigration, or whatever it is you think, well, of course you can still vote for leave, but don't vote leave, I think, if you thought you're going to be better off.
Paul in Hull says, I don't think I've ever heard Bridlington mentioned on the radio before, and then twice in 1 hour. Does your guest holiday there? It's got a lovely beach.
No, I come from Bradford, and so the place we used to go for seaside holidays were Scarborough, Bridlington, and my dad had a Blackpool
Too much
connection as well. So.
Paul, thank you very much. Let's go to Joe in Northampton. Hello, Joe.
Hello. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for fielding my question, Roger. I love the BBC. I even worked there during London 2012, covering all that lovely Olympic footage. But in the interests of impartiality and in effect, journalistic integrity, do you think the BBC still has that, given that obviously the board of directors do have sort of conservative influence, let's say, and also
they also have Labour influence as well. I mean, if you look at the makeup of that board, I know Robbie Gibb gets all of the publicity, but I think there's a trade union representative on there as well, so it's not all one-way traffic.
Okay, and in the interest of say funding the BBC, you said if the BBC was funded with government taxation, there'll be a bias, and obviously there might be control of the BBC via the government. But what do you think is the best way to fund the BBC with impartiality, at the helm?
Well, it's a good question, Joe, and I'm pleased you were part of the 2012 team. You could say it might be Parliament that funds
you were
the
his
BBC.
Boss, effectively.
I'm very proud to be that. But you could say that the government would fund from taxation, but it's something that would be a vote of Parliament. So I know that's not perfect, but you might look at ways in which there is a more democratic select committee type control of a BBC licence fee. As I say, the advantage of taxation is that it would be progressive, and you wouldn't be, some people who don't pay tax wouldn't be paying for the licence fee, and I think would feel better. I think it's a good point. There are known Conservatives on the BBC board, but I think there's always a disconnect between the people on the board and the editors don't pay that much attention, happily, to what the board is thinking about things. And what I would say,
What's the point of it, then?
Well, the point of it is that the board runs the BBC in a macro sense, and then the editors are allowed to get on with the programmes. And certainly I used to find, as an editor, that almost nobody interfered with what we were trying to do. But I think what Tim Davie is rightly doing is saying impartiality was going a bit awry in the 2010s, and it's time to focus on that. And a bit of old-time religion about what the BBC's for is not a bad thing.
Joe, do you want to come back?
No, I mean, I'm happy that question's been answered. Thank you so much.
Excellent, thank you. Let's go to James in Ayrshire. Hello, James.
Hello, Ian. Really interesting interview you have tonight. Question of balance in the BBC. Is it always good? Just two very quick examples. The BBC were still giving equal time to climate change deniers and climate change scientists long after the science was absolutely fixed. That was wrong. The second issue is a much more minor issue that your interviewee might comment on. I've recently noticed that Question Time, one of the flagship programmes, has started to actually comment on the type of audience they have in respect of how the constituency voted. I've noted that Fiona has said that, so today we're in Manchester, which is a Labour voting area, so we have some more Labour voters in, or if it's maybe in Surrey or somewhere, this area voted Conservative. And I'm not sure if that's a very good idea, to be honest with you. I mean, I would expect the audience just to be balanced. So there are two separate issues, very different issues about balance. And I wondered if your interview could comment on
James, how do you balance it? Because do you do it by the national general election result? I mean,
I don't think you balance it at all. I just think you try and have equal numbers of people with the different political persuasions.
That's ridiculous. You can't. If there's 100 people in the audience, you can't have 25 Conservatives, 25 Labour, 25 Liberal Democrats, and 25 others. That would be silly, wouldn't it?
Why can't you?
Well, because, for example, the Liberal
I don't see
Democrats are on
what-
9% in the opinion polls. They have
Yeah.
11 MPs.
Yeah, but then you're basing the ratio in audience on what I consider as a flawed voting system. So just be very careful. You're going to base the audience on the number of MPs
Okay, let's
in
bring
each party. Not good.
Let's bring in Roger.
Well, James,
Okay.
I'm not an expert in the way they do the question time audience, but maybe that's addressing something that I used to see happening a few years ago when they would come from, say, Lincoln, and the audience did not feel like it was a Lincoln audience. It looked like people had been bussed in. So I think it's probably better to say we're tonight in a conservative part of the country, so the audience will be a bit different. Just on climate change, though, I don't think
more important,
I
probably.
don't think you're right about that, because famously Nigel Lawson went on to the Today programme as a denier of human-made climate change, and that was a celebrated case. But over the years, if you look at people like Roger Harrabin and David Shukman, the BBC has been ahead of the game on climate change. And certainly as an editor, I would never regularly balance someone saying climate change is happening and someone saying it's not. What you might do is very occasionally put someone with a different view on. But for the most part, I think we accepted the science of climate change.
Okay, James, thank you very much indeed. We'll come to more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. If you've just tuned in, we're talking to Roger Mosey about his book, 20 Things That Would Make the News Better. Maybe you've got a few suggestions for us. It's 8:46.
LBC. Our play. LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 10 to 9 on LBC. Roger Mosey here with us, taking your calls on things that would make the news better. That's the title of his book. Let's go to Steve in Chelmsford. Hello, Steve.
Hi, good evening to you. Just one thing with regard to Donald Trump. I saw him coming because I got him at 10 to 1 with regard to the presidency the first time round.
No one likes a smart ass, Steve.
I just wonder, do you think that media has too much influence in politics in our country nowadays? I just think back to Partygate and the way that the media acted as if with like a dog with a bone, and how things subsequently panned out as a result.
I think it's a really important point, Steve, and Partygate is an enormous story, but it was probably overcovered sometimes against some of the other things happening in the world. So take the cost of living crisis, take Ukraine, and the amount of time we spent discussing where a birthday cake may or may not have been. It was important because it did hold the Prime Minister's fate, not the birthday cake, held it in its hands, but there were other things happening in the world that should have been covered more fully. And I think there is a too much of a Westminster bubble political and media stuff that just works itself up a bit like a washing machine in a spin cycle, when really what you want sometimes is some other stories that are going to change the agenda and tell you what's really going to matter.
But I can remember saying more or less what you've just said live on air, and honestly, that the heavens opened on me. I was the world's worst person because I was trying to sort of take attention away from Boris Johnson, which I wasn't at all, but sometimes you do think that the media there's a herd mentality, isn't there? It's the first one to break from the herd often is castigated for doing so.
Yes, and that's why you should sometimes ignore social media, because you've got to think about the general audience and what does the general audience need to know. And if you sometimes have a major story developing in Taiwan or Ukraine, or you're worried about inflation in the UK, you have to say, actually, you know what, we did the birthday cake last night, let's do it again in a week's time, but otherwise we're going to move on. And that doesn't mean you're pro-Boris Johnson. You may actually be more damaging to Boris Johnson to talk about how he's let inflation rip.
Right, 3 quickfire questions on text from Mark in Portsmouth. Should Rishi Sunak's new government scrap the idea of privatising Channel 4?
Yes.
Manon in Swansea. How should the BBC be covering the LGBT issues surrounding the World Cup in Qatar?
Well, I would say that they must cover them. They are very important. They should be a big part of news coverage. I'm a little bit reluctant about how much it goes into the sport coverage. And I don't know. I need to look back on this. My guess is that there wasn't very much in the BBC World Cup coverage from Russia about Putin. And that was, I mean, you can argue there probably was more of a global story there. So, sure, we should make our disapproval clear. It should be in the news coverage, but I probably wouldn't have it at half-time in England versus Wales.
And someone says, why are BBC breakfast presenters so rude and aggressive? This was never the case a few years ago.
Well, I'm a huge devotee of the wonderful late Bill Turnbull, and Bill was a personal friend and a great presenter.
People in broadcasting.
Do you know, I don't watch breakfast television. I used to do when I had to watch it as part of my job. I listen to the radio at breakfast.
Apart from on a Friday, obviously, when I'm on it.
Yeah, of course, Iain. Yeah. I always make a date.
Right, let's go. Let's go to Stan in Caterham. Hello, Stan. Stan, are you there?
Sorry. Hi, Iain.
Hi,
hi,
you are live on the radio, Stan.
Yes, thank you. I had a question to Roger, and I guess that's in line with the previous follow-up. Do you have any examples of broadcasters or news outlets that actually provide good coverage, unbiased coverage, rather than trying to form an opinion?
Yes, I think there are lots of them. I mean, the BBC is a wonderful organisation. And the whole point about the book is to say it's a great organisation, but it could do better. And so could all the media. I love LBC. I still listen to a huge radio, which is fantastic. And the most important thing is that if you let it erode, if you let it be chipped away, you risk losing it forever. And I really want to make sure that we keep the best of public broadcasting, in which I would include LBC and Sky and ITV and lots of other great broadcasters.
Stan, I sense you don't agree.
I don't think I agree, especially you mentioned ITV. Every interview starts with loaded questions. it's blatant opinion forming, and an example that the previous caller used about the Partygate. It's just a great example that BBC is very low bar right now.
Yeah, I'm not saying, and again, the whole point of the 20 things is how to make it better. And there are some pretty tough criticisms of all the broadcasters for following a herd instinct, sometimes concentrating on trivial, making politics worse. And I think the media does make politics worse. So I agree it could be better. All I'm saying is don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And if you do get rid of publicly funded broadcasting and impartial broadcasting, you're left with something far worse.
Stan, thank you very much. A tweet from ZZ Top, no less. Can you ask Mr. Mosey if he ever thought that we would ever have to combat fake news and have disinformation correspondents like the excellent Mariana Spring to shine a light on disinformation and the harm it can do?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been fake news of various kinds. I mean, people have always been combating. If you go back to, the 18th century and before, there's always been untrue stories. The trouble now is that the level of fakeness, the level of deep fake and using people in broadcasts that have been doctored is far more dangerous now, and social media can amplify it, and a story which sounds good but is untrue can be round the world before you can have a go at it. But you can't give up the battle. You've got to fight.
Charlie is in Culross. Hello, Charlie.
Hi there, Ian.
Hi.
Yes, I'd just like to refer back to the SNP conference. How should LBC report that? Because that night that Nicola Sturgeon spoke, I think you said that you couldn't get anybody for the SNP, but you just so happened to have the Scottish Labour leader on the phone, which I thought was quite convenient.
Well, we didn't just happen to have him on the phone, we invited him on.
Well, why would you do that, though? Well, the weeks before, you had Labour conference, which was Labour people, Tory conference, Tory people. So why would you invite...
And I remember the conversations I had with my producers that day, who were trying desperately to get somebody from the SNP to come on, and the SNP wouldn't provide, or either wouldn't or couldn't provide anyone to come on. You can't get blood out of a stone, Charlie. If somebody doesn't want to come on or won't come on, you can't force them to.
I know, but when I phoned up the LBC that day, and I know I'm not an SNP MP, but I'm an SNP supporter, and you could have phoned me.
I'll hand that one over to Roger. What would you have done in those circumstances, Roger? Because we genuinely tried our best to get someone from the SNP on, and generally they're very cooperative.
Let me take a broader perspective here, which is that I think that the Metropolitan London media do not understand SNP supporters and nationalist support in Scotland. They could be better. However, I think there are also some very tough factual questions about the currency, about borders, about a whole set of issues about independence, which also need to be examined thoroughly. So two things are true. Understand nationalist voters better, but give a tough time to SNP politicians because they've got questions they haven't yet answered.
Charlie, I suspect that doesn't satisfy your point, but look, I having spent 10 days in Edinburgh at the Fringe in August, that made me realise how, I won't say little I knew about Scottish politics and the independence debate, but it made me want to redouble my efforts to cover it properly. And I can assure you, whenever this referendum comes, and as it surely will at some point, I will do my best to give it, to give you the coverage that you want. And it's not going to be biased one way or another. Somebody's saying it's not Culross, it's Couros. So, see, I lose either way, don't I? Roger, it's been great to have you with us. Thank you so much indeed. His book is called 20 Things That Would Make the News Better. It's published by Bite Back. And just for the avoidance of doubt, I no longer have an interest in Bite Back, so I've got no conflict of interest in this whatsoever. And you can also hear Roger on my All Talk podcast in a couple of weeks. We recorded that this afternoon. We are going to cover the Iranian protests because they've really sparked up again over the past few days. So, and I think, as I said a few minutes ago, it's one of those world issues that I just don't think the media is covering itself in glory over, partly because it's so difficult to get pictures, but we're getting lots and lots of reports of more protests all over Iran. So I want to get your reaction to those. If you are from Iran originally, if you live in the UK or indeed